Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sheila Social Studies. Today we're going to be discussing more civil rights movements and other minority group movements during the civil rights movement, the modern day civil rights of the 1950s and 60s. So during the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement was predominantly focused on African Americans, and across the nation they were gaining lots of successes that resulted in new laws that put Black Americans on track to equal rights as their white counterparts. We have covered this information in class before, so I hope this idea seems familiar. When we covered reform movements in an earlier chapter, we discussed how the abolition movement to end slavery helped women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton fight for women's rights or suffrage or even the fight for temperance. So it is no surprise that when African Americans began to gain rights, other movements like the women's feminist movement, the Latino Chicano movement, and Native American movements began to take shape in America. So you have others demanding equality. In the United States, certain minority groups flourished in certain regions. During the 1960s and into the 1970s, the Hispanic population was growing very quickly. In 1960, there were only about 4 million Latino Americans, and within a decade, that number doubled to over 10 million, with the vast majority of them moving to the southwestern part of the United States. The origins of the Hispanic population in the United States was very diverse, with many immigrating from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and many other Latin American countries. With the success of African American civil rights movement in the nation, Hispanic Americans became encouraged to fight for their own rights, and with the population steadily rising, they would have numbers on their side. The only aspect that the Chicano movement was missing was an influential leader like Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, or Malcolm X. Who would choose to lead the way, and what type of form of protesting would they be in favor of? In stepped Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was born to poor parents in Yuma, Arizona, and when he was a child, his parents lost everything during the Great Depression. And just like many broke Southwestern farmers, his family moved to California to farm. Chavez dropped out of school at an early age to work on the farms. He served in a segregated unit in the military and continuously fought against discrimination against Hispanic Americans. He knew what it was like to be poor. He knew how it was to put others before himself. He knew what it was like to feed others, but not to be able to afford to feed his own family. He knew that he needed to fight for the farmers. Cesar Chavez became the voice for Hispanic Americans. Cesar Chavez knew that the Southwestern farmers were struggling for equal pay and better working conditions. Some farmers would only make around 40 cents per hour, and many did not qualify for unemployment benefits because they were not protected by any of the minimum wage laws, and the farmers' attempt to form unions were shot down by the power of the landowners. Cesar Chavez belonged to the local civil rights group that refused to walk the same path to help farm workers. So in 1962, Chavez emptied his life savings and poured it into a startup union named the National Farm Workers Association, the NFWA. The NFWA threw its support behind California grape farmers. Chavez believed in nonviolent civil disobedience like Martin Luther King Jr. He committed himself to earning rights, better pay, and better working conditions for farm workers. Chavez led the National Farm Workers Association in many protests against the California grape industry, and in 1965, the NFWA started a strike that would last for 5 years and turn into a national boycott of California grapes. In 1970, the strike ended and the farm workers won better wages and benefits. In 1972, the National Farm Workers Association would form into the United Farm Workers Union. Since Chavez was committed to nonviolent protests and he knew the importance of rallying the nation behind his cause, he sometimes took unconventional ways to garner attention to his cause. On multiple occasions, Chavez went on hunger strikes lasting between 20 and 30 days where he would not eat. He was able to inspire new young leaders in the Chicano movement. Chavez's work did not end with grape growers. He also fought for new rights for Latino Americans that led to the new legislation. He championed an amendment to the 1968 Elementary and Secondary Education Act that required schools to teach students whose first language was not English in both languages until they learned English. He also helped pass the Voting Rights Act of 1975, which required communities with large immigrant groups to have the ballots printed in the voters' preferred language. Chavez was victorious in many of his fights for equal rights. He was not the only person who fought for Hispanic rights in America or Hispanic American rights. A group called the Brown Berets modeled themselves and their tactics after the Black Panther Party, and as the Black Panther screamed Black Power, the Berets shouted Brown Power. So with the success of the African Civil Rights Movement and the emergence of the Chicano movement, other minority groups began to fight for their rights. This group does not seem like a minority now, but they were considered one in the 1950s and 60s. This is when women began the fight for equal rights. In the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, it was not uncommon to see advertisements in magazines or on television that showed a woman being subservient to men. It was common that a woman's place was in the home, caring for the children and waiting on their husbands, and for their hard work, he may purchase her a washing machine. Nice, right? Well, women began to bring attention to a woman's position in society. In the 1960s, women rarely held high-paying office jobs, were doctors or lawyers. Many times they were in a clerical position or an educator. Economically, their pay was much lower than their male counterparts, often performing much of the same work. In 1963, a government commission reported that there were fewer jobs and overall lower pay for women, and only legislation would be able to help equalize rights. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed, and it required many employers to pay men and women equal salaries for the same work. Equal work for equal pay. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, it not only banned discrimination on race, but it also banned discrimination on gender. Women began to question their traditional roles of being homemakers. So the women's rights movement began to pick up a full head of steam. Author Betty Friedan became a leader in the modern women's rights movement. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique that questioned many of the traditional roles of women and stressed their importance. It addressed the subservient roles to their husbands and argued that women could do so much more than what is expected of them. She asked women across the nation, "Is this all there is for a woman?" Americans couldn't actually believe that women were placed here to serve their husband and take kids to soccer practice, right? When women across the United States read the book, they began to come together to form a movement. In 1966, Friedan helped form the National Organization for Women, or NOW. The organization attempted to bring women into mainstream society and would demand equal pay for equal work, and pressured the federal government to support and strictly enforce legislation that prohibited gender discrimination. Many women's rights organizations believed that some of the changes that were being made in society should become officially law, and they supported an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Dating back to the early days of women's rights reformers, the National Women's Party proposed the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. It was met with criticism and was not able to be ratified by enough states to become law. It sat on the shelf until the 1960s and 70s, when the modern-day women's rights movement picked it up again and attempted to get it passed one more time. Many women believe that the only true way to eliminate gender-based discrimination in the United States was to make it a law. The Equal Rights Amendment demanded equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged by the United States or by any states on the account of sex. Discrimination based on sex would be outlawed. Unfortunately, in order for the amendments to become law, it is not a simple majority vote in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The amendment has to be proposed in the House and Senate by 2/3 majority. Then it has to be voted on and ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. That means that 38 states would have to ratify or approve the amendment in order for it to become law. In the beginning, the National Organization for Women pushed hard for the amendment to pass, and the fight was met with praise and results. 30 states would ratify the amendment within the first 3 years of arguing. Women were beginning to taste victory. However, out of nowhere, a determined, organized, conservative opposition began to voice its concerns about the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment. Who would fight back against such an idea of rights for women? Other women, that's who. Conservative activists like Phyllis Schlafly would form groups like Stop ERA to strike back against the movement. Schlafly believed in traditional roles for women and believed that if it changed, society would crumble. She believed that equal rights for women would bring changes to feminism that would be most undesirable to men. By the end of 1973, the momentum gained of passing the Equal Rights Amendment in Congress and its attempted ratification in the states began to come to a halt. 35 of the required 38 states had ratified the ERA, and that's where it stopped. It would not be ratified in the 1960s or the 1970s, and in January of 2020, the state of Virginia finally became the 38th state to ratify the amendment. However, because the amendment expired, legally it was not able to become law. That's not saying it won't. With a fight, it still might. This means it is still not law that men and women are equal in the United States. Even though it was not ratified, the women's movement achieved many goals. There were many new opportunities in the workplace as well as educational opportunities, and women began winning political offices in all levels of governments. Many other minority groups also began to fight for their equal rights. The last two that will be discussed in this this chapter, are Native Americans and the disabled. Just like the former Black Power and Black and Brown Power movements, the Native Americans began the Red Power movement. Protests were organized across the nation in Washington, D.C. as Native Americans fought for equal rights, with many protests ending in violence. However, there were some victories for natives as well. The American Indian Movement, the AIM, was founded in 1968 and pushed for legislation demanding equal rights, and the National Congress of American Indians helped win the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act in 1968. In 1970, the Disabled in Action was created to raise awareness of challenges facing people with disabilities and to work for the passing of legislation helping the disabled across the country. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was passed, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, in programs receiving federal financial assistance, in federal employment, and in the employment practices of federal contractors. In 1975, the Education of Handicapped Children Act that supported states and localities in protecting the rights of, meeting the individual needs of, and improving the results for Hector and other infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities and their families. The work didn't stop for the disabled when in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, was passed that outlawed all discrimination against people with disabilities. Even though this country has come a long way in distributing rights to people of all races, genders, and religion, there's still a long way to go for everyone to be truly equal. All right, guys, I'll see you next time.